Welcome to the 700 Club. The upcoming presidential election might be a November nightmare. Too many mail-in ballots could overwhelm the system.
Some states have already experienced major delays in counting votes from primaries, and far more people will be voting in November. Ben Kennedy brings us the story.
President Trump's tweet about mail-in voting leading to what he called would be an inaccurate and fraudulent election, and even asking to delay the election, was quickly shot down by both Democrat and Republican lawmakers. The president's tweet that began the political uproar asked delay the election until people can properly, securely, and safely vote. But speaking to the media later, the president made his views clear.
Do I want to see a date change? No, but I don't want to see a crooked election. This election will be the most rigged election in history if that happens.
Trump points to concerns over voter fraud and the massive problems with a presidential election depending so heavily on mail-in voting.
Well, what I want to explain to people, but it doesn't need much explanation. I mean, you look at article after article, New York's mail vote disaster. Tens of thousands of mail ballots have been tossed out in this year's primaries. What will happen in November?
New York tried to let voters stay safe from the coronavirus by letting them vote by mail in the June primaries, which led to massive delays. The system was overwhelmed with votes, and many races still haven't been counted weeks later. And New York warns the situation could get even worse in November.
A switch from almost no absentee ballots to approximately 50% absentee ballots with 2 months' notice really strains the system.
Trump referred to multiple news stories about the concerns with mail-in voting. California also experienced major problems, where more than 100,000 mail-in votes were rejected in the presidential primaries back in March. The Heritage Foundation's Hans von Spakovsky explained on CBN's Faith Nation that one problem with mail-in voting is the rejection rate is much higher than polling places.
Just look at the most recent elections and look at all the problems with the U.S. Postal Service misdelivering and not delivering absentee ballot.
And he doesn't think focusing on improving the mail-in process is the answer.
What election officials need to be doing is trying to ensure that as many polling places are open to vote in person. The CDC just released guidelines on how to safely do in-person voting with all those kind of safety protocols in place.
The president doesn't have the power to change the date of the election anyway. That's up to Congress, and they certainly don't plan to do so. But the concerns over a heavy dependence on mail-in voting aren't new. A Wall Street Journal editorial back in May warned that a close presidential election could result in an election nightmare. A close race where votes aren't counted, thrown out, and lawsuits filed. It could even result in an election that further divides an already polarized nation. Ben Kennedy, CBN News.
Well, it's unfortunate the president chose Twitter as the means to put this issue out in front of the American people and having a suggestion that the election be delayed. This isn't the proper forum for this kind of policy. We need to keep to the election schedule. We need to have a presidential election. That's number one. Number two, everyone involved in this process needs to know that their vote counts. Now we've got some problems because we're in the middle of a virus. Do you want to go to a public polling place and put your ballot in a voting booth that how many other people have used that particular day? I think the answer for many people is no, I don't, particularly if you're in the at-risk group. So we're looking at an avalanche of mail-in ballots, and the system clearly is not designed to deal with an avalanche. There aren't enough people within the election boards just to count them. And then the number of reasons your ballot could be excluded. Do you have the proper witnesses to your vote? Have you used anything else on the ballot? Some ballots are being thrown out just because somebody put a piece of Scotch tape on the back of it. Is the postage right? Is the postal stamp correct? All of these things need to come into play, and how do we deal with it? We have a postal service that routinely says we're in bankruptcy, we can't afford what we currently do. and now you're going to overwhelm it with all of these mail-in ballots. This is a time not for getting on Twitter. This is a time to seriously negotiate. How do we do this? How do we have a proper election? How can Democrats and Republicans get together? How can we do this on the state level, on the local level? Every one of these election boards is on a highly local basis. And how do you have standardized rules all the way through? It's a very short period of time. The lessons from New York have not been learned. The lessons from California have not been learned. And when you consider they're still counting ballots in New York after the primary, here we are weeks afterwards, and they're still counting them. Can you imagine being in December and saying we don't know who the next president is, and the vote is razor thin, and now all the allegations of fraud and improper voting and all of these things, the proposals from the Democrats are, let's go out and canvass for ballots. That means we're going to hire people to go out and pick up ballots. We've got to come to agreement on this. This is going to be one of the most contentious elections in U.S. history, and then to do it in the middle of a pandemic, we've got to look very long and hard at this. And if we don't get this right, it's not going to be a very happy America in December and in January. How long will it take to figure out who won? In other news, a top White House official is calling President Trump the right to try president. Why? Well, John Jessup has that story from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. John?
Thanks, Gordon. Alyssa Farah, White House Director of Strategic Communications, says the president is, quote, the right to try president when it comes to finding medicines to help fight off COVID-19. Farah spoke with CBN's David Brody about the use of hydroxychloroquine, which has been at the center of a great deal of controversy.
There are a lot of folks that say, hey, the president was right all along. What's the feeling inside the White House about hydroxychloroquine?
Well, I would start by saying the president is the right to try president. He passed historic legislation that helped terminally ill patients try medications that are still in the trial phase, anything to try to save their lives. So that's the mindset he approaches this virus with as well. We've always said, while talking about hydroxychloroquine, you should only take it in consultation with your medical professional, so with a doctor.
In the wide-ranging interview, Farah also discussed the possibility of mail-in ballot fraud in this year's election, plus the president's plan to protect people in the suburbs from anarchists and violence. You can see more of that interview on cbnnews.com. Well, friends and political officials from both parties are remembering Herman Cain, who died from complications from COVID-19. Cain grew up poor, but was highly successful in business and a licensed minister. He even ran for the White House in 2012. President Trump was among those who honored him.
Let me begin by expressing our sadness at the passing of a wonderful man and a dear friend of mine, Herman Cain. He was a very special person. I got to know him very well.
Herman Cain was 74. For months, a major question facing Washington and Jerusalem has been whether Israel should declare sovereignty over much of the biblical lands of Judea and Samaria, now known as the West Bank. Some believe the opportunity has passed, but outgoing Israeli UN Ambassador Danny Danon tells CBN's Chris Mitchell there's still time to make a historic move.
Ambassador Danon says the window is still open for declaring sovereignty before September's Jewish holidays and the U.S. election in November.
So the next few weeks are the crucial weeks for taking a bold decision. And you have two leaders that have to take that decision. First of all is our Prime Minister, our government. That's where you have to take the decision. And the support from our strongest ally, the U.S. Because history will judge the leadership according to those decisions.
Danon says the debate has morphed into a question of annexation, a word he calls a misnomer.
Chris, you cannot annex something that belongs to you. When you read the Bible, you understand that Judea and Samaria, it's part of our homeland. So you cannot annex it. We can apply sovereignty. And I think we should do it.
In May 2019, Danon famously addressed the UN Security Council and quoted from the Bible.
And I will give to you and to your descendants after you all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. This is a deed to our land. They were quiet, because no one can actually deny the claim of the Jewish people to the land of Judea.
Yet Danon says Israel stands on more than God's promise, but also international law and history.
Tell us as well about the importance of the San Remo resolution in this whole context, especially about applying sovereignty over Judea and Samaria.
In 1920, you have the San Remo Conference, where the superpowers come in together and actually acknowledge our rights to the land. And then you go back to 1945, when the UN was established. They actually accepted previous agreements. So they accepted the San Remo Conference, and today, according to the UN Charter, Israel has the rights to the land in Judea and Samaria.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu missed his July 1st goal of declaring sovereignty, and the issue divides his current Israeli coalition. Despite these and other challenges, Danon says it's time.
Yes, we are dealing with the COVID crisis, we have economical crisis, but at the same time, we have a friend in the White House. We have a friend which actually stand with us and give us the support to move forward. When you do something right, you just do it. And that's exactly what we have to do today. We cannot wait for a better timing for applying sovereignty over the communities in Judea and Samaria.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Ra'anana, Israel.
Thanks, Chris. Gordon, reading the tea leaves, does it look like Israel's going to make this move?
Well, I thought they would. I thought they would on the announced day. I mean, you have the prime minister saying we're going to do it on July 1, but here we are at the end of July, and it hasn't happened. So the reason it hasn't happened is not that it's not any longer their policy. The reason is there's deep divisions politically. And so will the coalition hang together? Will the coalition with Gantz hang together if Netanyahu moves forward? And so that shows that there are divisions within their own government. Is this the proper policy? And this has been something that Israel has done through the decades, where they hold out peace, they hold out the hope of a two-state solution, and they keep holding that even to the detriment of their own security and their own sovereignty. These aren't settlements, they're cities, they're places where Jewish people, Israeli citizens live. And so to say that they should not exercise sovereignty over the places where their citizens are already living sort of ignores the facts on the ground. But there's another division, and this is a probably even bigger one than what's happening in Israeli politics, is the division currently in the United States. It seems the electorate is hugely divided, and the parties are hugely divided. And on the Democrat side, there's already a bill in front of the U.S. Senate to restrict Israel's use of U.S. technology in its own defense if it moves forward with declaring sovereignty over Judea Samaria. So that's a big deal. That's a big deal for Israel. And if there's any question regarding the outcome of the presidential election and the Senate election and the House of Representatives, if the polling data is to be believed, it could be a Democrat landslide. And under that, you have a presidential candidate who's already said, Biden's already said, he's against this. So are you going to do it in face of the change of administration here? And what does that mean long term for Israeli security? So it's not an easy question, and there aren't any easy answers. At the same time, the facts on the ground are clear. This is Israeli territory and has been since 1967, and Israelis live there.